The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked up the long driveway to my daughter's house in Greenwich, Connecticut. The late September wind was carrying that particular sharp bite that tells you winter isn't far off. I had a folder tucked under my arm, the kind lawyers use, stiff and cream colored, with the notary seal pressed firmly into the corner. Inside that folder was a life I never thought I'd have. My brother Richard, God rest his soul, had left me everything. He'd spent 50 years building a commercial real estate empire from a single storefront, while I was busy keeping the lights on in the city's skyscrapers. He had organized everything through a living trust, allowing the entire estate to bypass the months of probate court and transfer directly into my hands. It was an estate totaling $15,800,000. I was coming to tell my daughter Brooke that her life was about to change, that her boys, Jackson and Lucas, would never have to worry about a college tuition. But as I reached the side door, I heard my son-in-law Bradley through the screen. He was calling me a walking liability, a financial drain. He chose to ignore my rock-solid union pension and decades of savings. In his eyes, I was just an aging obstacle standing between him and the equity in my home. He was plotting with Brooke to forge my signature on a power of attorney so he could dump me in a cheap nursing home and seize my bungalow for pocket change. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Have you ever been underestimated by someone just because of how you looked? I'd love to hear your story. I drove away from that Greenwich mansion with the same steady hands that used to handle high voltage lines in the middle of a blizzard. My truck, a 10-year-old rusting relic that Bradley called a liability, was the only thing that felt real. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't storm back inside to demand an explanation for 11 years of silence. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I went back to my small bungalow, sat at the kitchen table, and I began the accounting of my life. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And it was time to settle the debt. The $15,800,000 sitting in that folder was no longer just a gift. It was the fuel for the fire I was about to light under Bradley's feet. He wanted a confused old man. I decided to give him the performance of a lifetime. I realized then that I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, and my compassion was a luxury they'd overdrafted for the last time. I picked up the phone and I dialed Bradley's number. My heart rate didn't even skip a beat. When he answered, I let a long, heavy pause hang in the air, the kind that makes people like him feel very uncomfortable. Then I let my voice crack just enough. I told him I was sitting in the dark because I couldn't remember where I'd put the electric bill, and the lights had been flickering. I heard the immediate shift in his tone, that oily false concern, that masked, pure, undiluted greed. Don't you worry, Frank, he said. I could practically hear him, leaning back in his expensive chair, thinking he'd already won. I stumbled over my words, rambling about estate taxes and how I just couldn't make heads or tails of the paperwork. I told him I'd been thinking about what he said, that maybe the bungalow was becoming too much for me to handle alone. I suggested that maybe I should just sell it all and move somewhere where someone could look after me. The silence on his end was the sound of a wolf tasting blood. He didn't even try to talk me out of it. Instead, he started talking about Oak Sanctuary, a place he'd researched that was perfect for a man in my condition. He painted it as a luxury retreat, but he failed to mention his own hidden stake in the facility's parent company, a place where he could bury me while skimming my monthly care checks. I knew exactly what Oak Sanctuary was. It was a crumbling shell company he was using to hide his own debts, but I just thanked him, and I called him son for the first time in my life. As I hung up, the lights in my bungalow weren't flickering at all. They were bright, cold, and steady. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a father who had finally decided to protect his own. Bradley thought he was mining a seam of gold, but he had no idea He was actually digging into dynamite. I sat in my old recliner, the one Bradley said belonged in a landfill, and I looked at my hands. They are a roadmap of 40 years in high voltage electricity, calloused, scarred, and perpetually stained with the grit of a life spent in the dirt. I remember the night Lucas was born. I was 100 feet in the air in a bucket truck, while a gale force wind tried to shake me loose from the pole, just so I could clear an extra shift. Why? Because Brooke wanted that fairy tale wedding, and a tradesman's salary only goes so far when you're competing with the egos of Greenwich. I wrote the check for $120,000 for that single day of flowers and champagne. I didn't ask for a thank you, and I certainly didn't ask for a seat at the head table. I was a man of the brotherhood, a brother of the IBEW who believed that hard work and silence were the hallmarks of a provider. I was happy to be the foundation, but standing outside that door, hearing Bradley refer to me as a seam to be mined, I realized that I hadn't just been building a foundation for her, I'd been unknowingly funding her prison. I spent the better part of a week replaying the look on her face when she wouldn't meet my eyes. It wasn't hatred, it was the crushing weight of shame. It dawned on me that Brooke wasn't my enemy. She was a hostage. 11 years of marriage to a man who calculates love on a spreadsheet had left her spirit in tatters. I used to think she had grown cold, but now I saw the invisible chains wrapped around her soul. This is the trap of survival's invisible chains. Bradley had spent a decade convincing her that every instinct she had was wrong, that her father was a liability, and that she was lucky to have a man like him to handle the messy parts of life. He'd even set up a private P.O. box for all the household bills, ensuring that Brooke never saw a single late notice or bank statement, keeping her in a bubble of luxury while the foundation was rotting away. It's a psychological cage called learned helplessness. When a person is subjected to constant manipulation and gaslighting, they eventually stop trying to escape. The cell becomes the only world they know, and they become convinced that they are too weak to survive without their jailer. She sat at that table and she let him insult me because her survival mechanism told her to remain silent, to fade into the background until the storm passed. She was drowning in water, much deeper than I could see from the shore, and all she needed was a hand to pull her out. But I wasn't going to just give her a hand. I was going to drain the entire ocean. My daughter wasn't the traitor. She was the prize I was coming to take back. Bradley thought he could use her love for me to commit fraud, but he failed to realize one thing about an electrician who has spent 4 decades around live wires. We know exactly which line to cut to shut down the entire system without making a sound. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a recovery operation. Bradley pulled into my driveway exactly at noon. He stepped out of his car, looking like he was visiting a museum of poverty, careful not to let his polished shoes touch the oil stains on the concrete. As he sat across from me, I didn't see a son-in-law. I saw a predator with a $15,000 watch wrapped around a wrist that was shaking from the weight of $2 million in debt. It is a strange thing about men like Bradley. They will lose the roof over their heads before they will lose the illusion of being the most successful person in the room. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if I had eaten. Instead, he slid a thick document across the table, the contract for Oak Sanctuary. I knew the name because my forensic team had already found the link between that sanctuary and the offshore accounts Bradley used to hide his crypto losses. To the world, it was a care facility. To Bradley, it was a place to bury the evidence of his father-in-law's freedom while he liquidated my bungalow for pocket change. Frankie said, using that soft, patronizing voice people use with children and the dying, we are all worried. Brooke is losing sleep. The boys are asking why Grandpa is acting so strange. He leaned forward, the light from the kitchen window glinting off the sapphire crystal of his watch. You forgot the hockey tournament last month. You were leaving the stove on. It is not safe anymore. It was a textbook execution of gaslighting. He wanted me to doubt my own reality, so I would hand him the keys to it. He brought up Jackson and Lucas, telling me that if I really loved them, I would not want them to remember me this way, as a burden, as a liability. He was using my grandsons as emotional bait, dangling their love in front of me like a threat. I put on my best confused old man squint. I picked up the pen with a hand that I forced to tremble just a little. I watched the vein in his temple pulse. He was so close to the prize he could taste it. But then I set the pen down. I want to sign this, son, I said, my voice shaky and uncertain. But it needs to be done right, with a notary and proper witnesses at a real office so no one can question it later. I really do. But my memory, it is just so foggy lately. I need a few days. I told my old union lawyer I would let her take a quick look, just for peace of mind. You understand, right? The frustration flashed across his face for a split second before the mask of false concern slid back on. He did not like the delay, but he could not push too hard without breaking the charade. Of course, Frank, but do not wait too long. We need to get you settled before winter hits. I smiled at him. It was the same smile I used to give the apprentices who thought they knew more about a transformer than I did right before they blew the fuse. He walked out of my house thinking he was the wolf and I was the lamb. He had no idea that I was not just reading his contract, I was currently dismantling every wire in his house of cards. I shed the flannel shirt and the split-sole boots like a molted skin. I spent a lifetime in blue-collar work, but I knew that to kill a wolf in Manhattan, you had to look like the man who owned the forest. I put on a charcoal suit I'd bought in secret, tailored, sharp, and cold. When I walked into the high-rise office on Wall Street, the confused old man was gone. In his place was the man who had survived 40 years of high-voltage lines, and I was about to deliver a lethal shock. Teresa, my attorney, didn't offer me a seat. She just slid a manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. Beside her sat Mr. Chen, the forensic accountant whose eyes looked like they were made of binary code. A few $1,000s from my brother's legacy had bought me the best digital bloodhounds money could buy. They didn't see a retiree. They saw a client who had authorized a tactical strike. The report was devastating. Bradley wasn't just treading water. He was anchored to a $2 million debt that was pulling him straight to the bottom. He had lost over $200,000 in a cryptocurrency scam the previous autumn. He'd exploited a loose-end notary he'd done favors for in the past to push the paperwork through without her ever knowing. To cover the bleed, he had done the unthinkable. He had forged Brooke's signature on a second mortgage for their Greenwich home. He had gambled with the roof over his own children's heads just to keep up the appearance of a high-stakes manager. Looking at those figures, I realized Bradley was suffering from the power illusion of an empty wallet. It's a specific kind of psychological sickness where a man confuses having with being. Bradley's entire identity was a rented costume. He thought the $15,000 watch made him powerful, but without the stolen money, he was just a hollow shell with a leather strap. He lacked the internal wealth, the character and integrity to stand on his own 2 feet. When you have no foundation of your own, you start trying to harvest one from the people you are supposed to protect. The accounting showed he was currently being investigated by the financial authorities for misappropriating $210,000 of client funds. He had exactly 6 weeks before the house of cards collapsed and he was exposed to the world. He wasn't trying to help me because I was a liability. He was trying to dispose of me because I was his final bailout. He needed my bungalow and my brother's money to pay off the crimes he'd committed in the dark. I didn't feel rage, I felt a strange, icy precision. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a criminal enterprise, and I was the primary evidence. I rubbed my eyes, not because I was tired, but because I was visualizing the circuit. I knew exactly where to place the jumper cables to watch him burn. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. And I was about to close the account. I invited Bradley to Teresa's office on a Friday afternoon, telling him it was time to sign the bungalow over and finalize the power of attorney. He showed up 15 minutes early, looking like a man who had just won the lottery. He was wearing a fresh suit and that $8,000 watch, radiating the smugness of a predator who thought his prey had finally walked into the trap. Brooke was there too, sitting at the far end of the oval table. She looked like she was attending a funeral, her eyes red and her hands trembling. "Let's get this done, Frank," Bradley said, sliding a gold pen toward me with a practiced casual grace. "It's the best thing for everyone, for the boys, for your own safety." I looked at the pen, then at Bradley. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I reached into my bag and I pulled out 2 folders. I laid them on the table, side by side. One was the cream-colored folder containing my $15,800,000 inheritance. The other was the manila envelope filled with the evidence of his crimes. "I find something interesting. While I was going through my brother Richard's estate files, Bradley," I said. My voice was steady, like a low-voltage hum before the surge. "He didn't just leave me the cottage and the rentals. He'd set up a separate trust for Jackson and Lucas, $750,000 intended for their future." I watched the color begin to leave his face. It started at his collar and it moved upward. "But when my accountant looked into that trust, he found it was empty," I continued. "You'd used your financial advisor credentials to talk Richard into making you a co-trustee, supposedly to manage the taxes. Someone had been making unauthorized withdrawals for 2 years. Signature mismatch, systematic embezzlement, $750,000 of my grandson's future gone." Bradley tried to stand, but Teresa, my lawyer, spoke with a voice like iron. "Sit down, Bradley." "Frank, I can explain," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking. "It was an investment, a temporary move to bridge some gaps. I was going to put it back." "You weren't going to put anything back," I said, sliding the manila folder across the table. "Inside here is the summary of the $750,000 of debt you've racked up in my daughter's name, the forged second mortgage on your own home, and the report from the financial authorities about the $210,000 you stole from your clients." I opened the cream folder then, the one he'd been salivating over for weeks. I turned it to the final page and I pointed to the bottom line. "Total estate value of $15,800,000. I was coming to your house that day to pay off your mortgage and set your family free, but then I stood on your back step and I listened to you call me a walking liability. I heard you plan to dump me in a shared room so you could harvest my life for parts." Bradley stared at the numbers on the page, then at me. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. He dropped to his knees, literally clawing at the edge of the table. "Frank, please, for Brooke, for the boys. If you do this, I'm ruined. I'll go to prison." I looked at him with the clinical detachment of a man checking a circuit breaker. "You aren't ruined because of me, Bradley. You're ruined because you're a thief. You thought family was a seam to be mined. You thought I was the seam. You were wrong. I was the dynamite." I looked at Brooke. She was staring at Bradley with a mixture of horror and realization. The invisible chains were finally snapping. She didn't move to help him. She didn't say a word. Detective Rowan entered through the side door then, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. "Bradley, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and breach of trust." As they hauled him out, the only sound in the room was the heavy thud of the door closing. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the quiet, cold satisfaction of a job finished. The account was closed. Bradley was eventually charged with forgery, uttering forged documents and fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code. The financial authorities hit him with breach of trust charges as well. He pleaded out rather than face the forensic evidence in a public trial. He got 4 years in a federal institution, and he will likely be out in 2 if he maintains good behavior. I hope those 2 years feel like 20. I hope every single night he spends in that cell, he thinks about that cream-colored folder and the life he threw away because he could not see the value of the people right in front of him. Teresa handled Brooke's divorce with the same icy precision she used on the audit. The forged loans in Brooke's name were completely unwound by the courts because a forged signature is not a valid contract. We sold the Greenwich mansion before the ink was even dry on the divorce decree. Neither of us could bear the thought of Jackson and Lucas growing up in rooms where Bradley had drafted his betrayals. I bought Brooke a new home in Burlington with a big maple tree in the front yard and a finished basement where the boys can run wild. I paid for it in cash and I put it entirely in her name. Jackson and Lucas have their university educations fully paid for now, thanks to my brother Richard's foresight. I also established a scholarship fund in Richard's name, specifically for people entering the trades, for the electricians, the plumbers, and the truckers who keep this world running. Brooke quit that stressful marketing job she complained about every Sunday. She is already 40,000 words into her first book about a single mother raising 2 sons in Connecticut. And I can tell it is going to be powerful. I have come to realize that some people treat family like a mine, something to be stripped of every ounce of value until the seam runs dry. They think the elderly are just liabilities waiting to be managed or seams to be exploited. But family is not about what you can extract from them. It is about what you are willing to give. Bradley never understood that. He thought I was the seam, but I was the dynamite. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, like you are only valued for what you provide or seen as a problem to be solved, I want you to know you are not alone. It takes a specific kind of courage to set a boundary with the people you love and to stop being a source for those who only want to extract from you. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free from their expectations. Richard's millions were just paperwork until the day Brooke chose her family back. That was the day I actually became rich. Now, we spend our summers at the waterfront cottage on the lake, watching the loons and enjoying the silence. It is a quiet life, but it is an honest one. Never let anyone tell you that you are a burden just because you have aged. You are the foundation. You are the one who keeps the fire burning. If this story spoke to your heart, please hit the share button. Let's remind the world together that there are silent heroes who should never be underestimated. Thank you for being a part of our community.